Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for the Glenn College Colloquium Series. We're excited to have not one but two speakers with us today. Before we get started, I wanted to remind the audience that our culture is to allow the speaker to present for the first 30 to 40 minutes with only clarifying questions. Of course, the speaker may pause and ask for feedback, but we otherwise ask that you hold your more substantive questions until the end of the presentation. We truly value audience engagement and hope to have a dynamic and constructive discussion at the conclusion of the presentation. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Moulton to introduce our wonderful speakers.
Great, thank you guys. I know you can't see me, but I'm here on Zoom. I have a cold that I decided to spare everybody from, so I'm talking virtually today. But we're super excited to have Becky Nesbit and Megan present some of their really great research. If you're not familiar with the work that they've been doing in this space, they've really been doing hard work to kind of break down some of the disciplinary silos and how we think about public affairs research. And so really on that spirit of interdisciplinarity and learning across disciplines. So excited to have them here today. And I wanted to also give a shout out for Becky. So for those doctoral students on the call, Becky was my mentor when I was at Indiana University, and I would not have gotten a PhD without Becky. She supported me in times of crisis and breakdowns. And so Becky, I owe a lot to you, and I'm so glad that you're here and that we can welcome you into the Glenn College. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephanie. I didn't even know that history, Stephanie, so that's pretty awesome. So I'm going to go a little bit further introducing Becky Nesbit and then turn things over to her at the start of our presentation. So Becky Nesbit is an associate professor at the nonprofit management, I should say, in the Department of Public Administration and Policy at the University of Georgia. That's actually where I did my PhD. So that's how Becky and I know each other. And she received her PhD, as Stephanie mentioned, from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Bloomington. And a lot of her work explores philanthropy and volunteerism, but it goes across a bunch of topics that are really relevant to public affairs. So kind of policy implementation, public management, and her work has been widely published in NBSQ, NML, sorry, I should not use the nonprofit acronyms just in case, but nonprofit and voluntary sector quarterly, nonprofit management and leadership, also JPART and PAR for our public administration folks. So really widely published and respected scholar, and I'm so lucky to get to work with her and happy to have her here. So I will turn things over to Becky to kick off our presentation.
Great, thanks, Megan. So I'm going to start by telling you a little anecdote about how we got started on this research. So as Megan said, she was a doctoral student at Georgia, and we co-taught a nonprofit class together. So like foundations of nonprofit sector. And in the course of doing that, had a lot of conversations about how unhappy we were with the resources we had to teach theories of the nonprofit sector or other theories to our students. We just didn't feel like a lot of the resources were very accessible, and it just brought up a lot of questions for us around the use of theory in nonprofit studies. And we did an article together that was published in an education journal, nonprofit education journal, that was about how to teach theory to students. And we'd come up with some strategies and activities and questions to use to not only help students to understand theory, but to help them to understand how to apply it. Because that's also a challenge in an applied field like ours and like public administration is, not only do we need students to understand theory, but to help them see how it's relevant to what they do. And we were presenting at a conference, and one of the questions we got at the conference had to do more with kind of a descriptive landscape, like what theories are these scholars using, what's actually going on. And so we thought, well, we need to get some data that we can use to answer that. Like that's a great starting place for thinking about theory and nonprofit studies. And so we started collecting this bibliometric data and trying to come up with this, describe what this landscape looks like. And as we were doing that, one of the offshoots of that is we're really interested in this nexus of public administration and nonprofit studies. So as Megan said, my background and my PhD was in public administration from IU Bloomington, and I'm also a nonprofit scholar. So working in that nexus, I think, is a really interesting place to be. It's a really valuable place to work where public administration and nonprofit studies overlap. And it's also very interesting to, this is something I talk to doctoral students a lot about is, how do you speak to these two different audiences, public administration scholars in their journals, nonprofit scholars in their journals. And so that was kind of the impetus for this particular paper is, we're interested in that space where PA scholars and nonprofit scholars play together and the topics that they find interesting. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So what we're interested in is knowledge integration. And knowledge integration, so there's different ways to build scholarship, to do scholarship and to build on previous work. And a lot of scholarship tends to be incremental, right? We're making just incremental gains in knowledge. Knowledge integration is basically true interdisciplinarity. And what we mean by that is when knowledge from one discipline is integrated into another discipline in a meaningful way. So in such a way that it changes the discipline that brings that knowledge in. So it basically shifts paradigms. And knowledge integration is valuable because it leads to innovation. It leads to bigger gains in knowledge than just kind of incrementally building on what's come before. So it's going to advance science faster, and it can be used to solve complex problems. Now, one of the places where they talk about knowledge integration a lot is in STEM fields, science, technology, math. But in an applied field like public administration, like nonprofit studies, like public policy, this is also important because the type of research we do is and can be used to solve complex problems in the real world. So that's why this knowledge integration is valuable. So we believe that taking a look at and understanding where this knowledge integration is happening can also be valuable for us. So the way to capture or study knowledge integration is through bibliometric bibliometric methods. So a bibliometric record codifies knowledge production. So a bibliometric record would be like an article or a book. And connections between those records, which are citations, indicate the use of shared concepts, shared theories, shared methods. So if I'm citing, other work, I'm connecting to that work. So our questions here, what we're interested in is this area of public affairs broadly construed. So nonprofit studies, public administration, and public policy. These are all, multidisciplinary fields of research that have overlapping topics that they're interested in. And while there are a few articles that kind of conceptualize this overlap, there's not really a lot of research that helps us to understand the extent to which knowledge integration is happening within the nexus of these different fields. So it's conceptually unclear and empirically underexamined. So that's what we're interested in is what does this landscape of this research nexus look like? And to what extent does research in that nexus integrate knowledge from the three different fields? So, is there particular topics that's pulling more from PA or public policy or nonprofit? And that's what we're going to look at. But to start, knowledge integration, we have to talk about how do you capture that? How do you understand and think about knowledge integration? And we use kind of a slight adaptation of a framework proposed by Raffles and Meyer. And they have two big dimensions to their framework. One is disciplinary diversity, and the second is citation network coherence. So disciplinary diversity is just basically the number and balance of the different bodies, degree of difference between the different bodies of knowledge concerned. So for us, in terms of discipline, the more diverse scientific disciplines that a publication cites, the more opportunities there are going to be for knowledge integration. So basically, is it pulling from many disciplines or just pulling from one particular discipline? So we can look at to what extent a particular publication or body of knowledge pulls from, has diverse disciplinary connections. The second type of connection is citation network coherence. And this is the extent that topics, concepts, tools, etc. are related to each other. So if you have high citation network coherence, it represents more of a foundation of shared understanding. Like maybe we're all citing the same work for a definition of a particular concept. That high network coherence, it just means that the work is more coherent. It's pulling from a shared foundation rather than different studies pulling from different foundations. So low network coherence is areas where there could be more knowledge integration, but it hasn't taken place yet. So if we put this together into a little framework, it's going to look like this. So here's disciplinary diversity, which can be high or low. Okay, and then in the little graphic for us, disciplinary diversity is these different shapes. So this would be low disciplinary diversity where it's dominated by one discipline. Here is higher disciplinary diversity where there's more balance between more disciplines. And then the two columns are citation network coherence, low and high. So citation network coherence in these graphs would be fewer connections is lower citation network coherence. More connections, so more citing is going to be high network coherence. And this divides it up into 4 different quadrants. So up here, if we have high disciplinary diversity and low citation network coherence, this is the place where there's potential to integrate knowledge across these different disciplines. Quadrant B, high network coherence, high disciplinary diversity. This is where knowledge integration has already taken place because we have the network coherence and we have the diversity of disciplinary contributions. Here in the low area, this is again, where there's potential to integrate knowledge from PATP or nonprofit journals. And then there's over here, there's a record of integration of knowledge, but it's happening within a particular discipline, not necessarily across, pulling work from multiple disciplines. So this is the framework that we're going to use to look at this research nexus between public administration, public policy, and nonprofit studies. So I'm going to let Megan tell you about our data and how we're doing that.
Great. And before I do that, I can't see if Caroline Wagner is on the call, but I just want to thank Caroline Wagner for actually introducing us to the Rockville's Empire framework, because of course she does a lot of research on science of science, and that's where we're integrating this knowledge. So in terms of the data that we used, if you recall at the beginning of the presentation, and Becky, maybe we can move this banner to the bottom of the screen. So we had 2 different research questions, right? So the first one is to just start to map the landscape of research at this intersection of public administration, public policy, and nonprofit studies. And to do that, we are drawing on data from the Web of Science. And the reason we're using Web of Science is it's a really clean data set that looks at knowledge production across all different fields. And interestingly, the way that Web of Science has our fields categorized is basically there is a giant public administration category that's actually subsumed under political science still. And NBSQ is part of that, but actually the other 2, what Nonprofit Studies House would consider the top nonprofit journals, NML and Voluntas, are in, I think they're in social issues and social work. So, so one of the things that we had to do is figure out how we were going to distinguish public administration and public policy journals, because Web of Science doesn't do that. So I can talk to you more about that, how we did that later on if you'd like. But the bottom line is for this part of our analysis, we were looking at around 20,000 articles and over 1 million citations from across those articles. And we did a couple of different things. The first was we were just looking at how many articles were published in each of these fields over our time period from 2009 to 2020. And then we also started to look at and visualize a direct journal citation network to look at which journals were citing each other. So we're going to start with, if I can get this to advance. Where am I going to get that? Nope. Okay. We'll roll with it. Okay, so this bar graph is just a measure of how many articles were published in the journals of the different fields over our period of time. So what you can see is the white is a little light, sorry about that. But public policy publications definitely went up over this period. So did nonprofit studies. For public policy, that was in part because there were more journals that actually became indexed in Web of Science that are public policy journals over that period of time. For nonprofit studies, it's because Voluntas started publishing, the number of articles that they were publishing went up over that period of time. So, broadly, we've got growth in public policy and nonprofit studies. Public administration is kind of plateaued a little bit. If you want to progress to the next slide. So then the next thing that we looked at was okay. is this direct journal citation network. So what we're looking at here is each of these nodes is a journal, okay, and that's in one of our fields. And the size of the node is based on the number of articles that were published in that journal over a period of time. And two journals are linked if an article in one of the journals cites that other journal. Okay, so, and then we did a cluster analysis of this. And what this allows us to see is which journals tend to cite each other a lot, right? And so that means that it's one indication that there's starting to be this shared knowledge base among those journals. So what we can see is that over here, we've got a cluster that we call core public administration. So this is where JPART is, this is where PAR is. Up here, we've got the three nonprofit journals. So NBSQ, Voluntas, and NML. Then we've got a cluster that's kind of a specialized PA that is our bridge to this policy focused journals. So what this tells us is a couple of things. One is that there are distinct fields, right, that are all contributing to public administration. That's why we can find the clusters in the first place. But the links between these journals and these clusters also tells us that there is this shared space, right, that we're really interested in. And so the next step was to dig into that shared space a little bit more. So to do that, we looked at a subset of the articles that we looked at for our first analysis. So the first thing that we did is, because we were interested in the Nexus, is we looked at the public administration and public policy articles that cited a nonprofit journal. And we looked at the nonprofit articles that cited a public administration or public policy journal. So that cross citation is going to tell us that there's something about the topic that they're studying that is of interest to, where they're drawing on both of the fields. So that left us with about 2,000 articles and about 300 citations. And the first thing that we did is we just wanted to look at, trends in that cross citation over time, those cross citing articles. And then the next thing that we did is we wanted to identify the topical areas that were coming up in these articles, right? So we started off by looking at what had been written so far about that, which was not a ton. We also did some experimenting with topic analysis, which is a kind of machine learning. We were not super excited about those results. There were some big issues with it. I'd love to talk to you about that more if you'd like to later on. And so we ended up using more of a traditional hand coding process to dig into those topics. And then the last thing that we did was we circled back around to use that typology of knowledge integration to look at what was happening in that shared space between our fields. All right, so first of all, just trends in these co-citing articles. So what we have here is this is the number every year of public policy articles that cited a nonprofit journal. Here we've got the number of public administration articles that cited a nonprofit journal. Here we've got the number of nonprofit articles that cited either a PA or a journal. So we can see that there's definitely some differences in the level of cross citation that's going on, where nonprofit studies is citing a lot of public administration, public policy journals, but less so the reverse. Okay, and so then the next thing we wanted to do again was to think about exactly what topics are in that shared space. And we started off by looking at what had already been written about that space. So this involved looking at, in some cases, bibliometric studies, although there are very few in public affairs right now. And they often tend to be focused on a specific topical area, not looking at the field level. But we looked at those, we looked at articles that were describing the kinds of topics in each field and looking for overlap there. And so that let us generate the start list of topical categories for a first round of provisional coding. So basically what this means is we started looking for these different areas as we were going through the abstracts of these cross-citing articles. And then we did a round of elaborative coding where we went beyond this list. Go ahead, you can go to the next slide. So what you can see here is that The areas that are in gray are things that we were expecting to find, right? Like civic engagement, political participation, and philanthropy and charitable giving, financial management. Brian, this is where we start to get into your area of research. But there were also some things that hadn't come up before in the articles that we were looking at, which included, so organizational behavior and civil society kind of came up, but in a much more, a much narrower way. So personnel administration came up in what had previously been covered, but we found that we needed to expand that to talk about organizational behavior. Because there's a lot of research that looks at why people choose to go into jobs in particular sectors. And that was part of what was encompassed in here. Also like public service motivation and all of that research, which isn't really about personnel management per se. Civil society is talked about a little bit in terms of civic engagement and democracy. So think like Putnam, for example. But the civil society literature that's here is much more international. It's not focused so much on the United States and social capital in the US. And then these three areas in yellow were things that had not come up previously in the work that had been written about topical areas. So this was we were a little surprised this hadn't come up earlier because both public administration and nonprofit studies actually spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's special about our sector, right? And how do we conceptualize it as the organizations and especially as being maybe different from business firms. But also critical issues for nonprofit distinctiveness and social entrepreneurship, value, and innovation. You can't see it under here. There's also a little area that's focused on teaching and education. Okay, so if you would like, in our paper, we actually not only break down the count of percentage across each of these, but we do this by field, and then we also provide the top citation for each of these topical areas. All right, so then we get into the knowledge integration. So this is taking those 4 quadrants that we conceptually presented earlier. And what we've actually done is we've mapped the topics onto here. So this is, again, the diversity of journals cited. And then this is the knowledge, this is the network coherence, citation network coherence. So this is a little difficult to deal with. So instead, we're going to present this in table form. And what we see is that there are only 3 areas in yellow where there's actually a really strong track record of knowledge integration across the 3 fields of public affairs. And that is financial management, public service provision, and collaboration networks and partnership. So you can kind of see why those areas would really lend themselves to a lot of knowledge integration. So this would be where, PA scholars are really drawing on nonprofit studies articles to think about how nonprofits are affected, for example, by government contracting and collaboration and partnership. The financial management piece was the most interesting to me. I was not expecting that to be an area of high knowledge integration, but it was. And then there are some other areas where there's relatively high disciplinary diversity, but low citation network coherence. So that tends to be the sector relations and distinctions, critical issues for nonprofit distinctiveness, this teaching and research, teaching and education, and then public policy, governance, organizational performance, accountability, and transparency. These other areas are either there's a record of integration within just one of the fields. So like philanthropy and charitable giving, there is a strong foundation of knowledge, but it's all within nonprofit studies. It isn't really being drawn upon and cited for public administration, which we think is for public policy, which is a huge opportunity, we think, because understanding how philanthropy happens and drawing on some of those insights from nonprofit studies is going to be really important as we're relying on the nonprofit sector for providing the financial resources for organizations to actually provide public services, for example. And then there's other areas where there isn't even a track record of integration within a particular field. So civic engagement and political participation in the articles that we were looking at, they were still kind of lacking this shared foundation of knowledge even within nonprofit studies. All right, and I think we're getting into the kind of overview of main findings and discussions. I'm going to turn it over to Becky.
Okay, so just kind of to recap where we've been, the Journal Citation Cluster Network found that, PA, PP, nonprofit all share knowledge, but they're also distinct fields of study. PA and PP are more closely connected to each other than they are to nonprofit studies. But there are overlapping in each interests across those three fields. As Megan said, the volume of research in all those areas is increasing, although in public administration it tends to be a little bit more flat. And the volume of nonprofit has grown more. Megan gave you the reasons for that, partly who's being included in Web of Science, but the nonprofit journals are they've just added more articles every year. Nonprofit articles are increasingly citing from public administration and public policy, but the percent of journals in public administration, public policy citing nonprofit has been consistent over time. Okay, great. And then, as Megan said, there's some areas where we're seeing knowledge integration, some topics where there's greater potential for knowledge integration across the three multidisciplinary fields, and then just some areas where there's just been low knowledge integration. And we do want to say, knowledge integration isn't the only goal of science. It is valuable. It can do a lot to advance knowledge, but there are times where building your own field and increasing the coherence with your own field is of value. So we're not saying that it should be all knowledge integration all the time, but there is great value in knowledge integration. So kind of the big conclusions or takeaways here is that the nonprofit nexus with public administration and public policy, it's a stable and intellectually productive area of study. Public administration has a much larger impact on nonprofit studies than the reverse. And that's probably due to just some of the historical intertwining of the two fields and the fact that, a while ago, there were a lot of scholars that just argued that nonprofit programs should be housed in public administration. And so there's a lot of people doing work in nonprofits who, like myself, have training and background in public administration. So there just tends to be a close connection there. And then when you factor in publication requirements and what your department wants, there's even more kind of incentive to keep that connection close. We did find that research on management topics or interorganizational research was more common within the research nexus than micro-level forms of participation like volunteering, charitable giving, civic engagement. That was less common in the research nexus. And so, our research does show that there's areas where we could maybe be more intentional about knowledge integration and bringing in knowledge from other fields. Both public administration and nonprofit are interested in civic engagement for different reasons with different questions, but knowledge integration could potentially help us move that knowledge forward faster. And so we see this article has been published in part. We have a part 2. That's going to be coming, we're going to be finishing very shortly here. But we see this as a solid groundwork to be more intentional about knowledge integration, to understand where it's happening, where it's not happening, and what we can do to kind of build our scholarship. So one of our next steps is to look at the contribution of other disciplines to public administration, public policy, and nonprofit at this particular research nexus. And we do have a few slides with some of our hot off the press results that we can show you if you're interested during the Q&A. We also have some related work where we're looking just at nonprofit studies broadly and trying to look at knowledge production within nonprofit studies and the different topics that are being studied in nonprofit studies, but also knowledge integration and particularly disciplinary knowledge integration across nonprofit studies as well. And our first article from that series was published in the 50th anniversary of nonprofit voluntary sector and non-voluntary sector for nonprofit volunteers. Okay, envious kid. So we did want to leave you with just some of our thoughts for scholars, like what do we do with this? Some of our recommendations is be clear and thoughtful about conceptualizations and definitions, because this is where sometimes some of the messiness is, and those topics that have kind of clear, consistent definitions that are used in multiple studies have that higher citation network coherence. And if you are speaking to a different audience, if you do work in that nexus and you're sometimes speaking to, trying to publish in a public policy journal or a PA journal or a nonprofit journal, make an effort to show how maybe the conceptualizations of one topic in nonprofit studies is slightly different than how people in PA or public policy think about that, and be deliberate about showing that, how those conceptualizations might be different across these fields. We also call for more targeted translational research aimed at these other fields. And what we mean by that is research where, maybe I'm a nonprofit scholar, but I want to talk to PA scholars, or I want to talk to public policy scholars. And so trying to publish in those journals with the intention of showing those scholars how the research in nonprofit studies can be relevant to them. So one example of that is an article written by Arthur Brooks, where basically he said, here's how 3 areas where nonprofit studies can contribute to the big questions of public management. And he made an argument for, some of the knowledge that's being produced in nonprofit studies and how that can be brought into public administration. And we'd like to see more of that research targeted in all those different fields, and also they can go the other way. How can some of the research being done in public administration further and advance the work that's happening in nonprofit studies? And then, for scholars from other disciplines, translational research that's targeted at their own field of study. So if you're a sociologist and you're doing work in this nexus, how can you help bring in, methods, concepts, theories from your home discipline to inform the research that's happening in this nexus? And just being more intentional about producing that translational research to help scholars from different backgrounds to see how these pieces, how this knowledge connects to each other. And with that, we are going to open it up to your questions and comments.
And I think, as is the tradition, we'll go to doctoral students first. So I don't know, Megan, do you want to moderate questions since I can't see who's raising hands?
So I don't think we have any questions. Stefan just said it's great audio, but that was like way at the beginning. Thanks, Stefan.
I have a quick one in the meantime.
Sure.
At the beginning, you mentioned how you noticed that some, like in Web of Science, how they organized it a little differently and how you had to manage that. What was your approach and why did you organize things the way they did?
Sure. So our approach, we kind of took 2 steps. So one is that, as a lot of people in this room will know, there's a lot of signaling that goes on in the titles of different journals. So oftentimes a journal will have policy in the title, and usually that's an indication that it's probably oriented more towards policy, and then or management or administration in the title. So that was one way that we differentiated that. And then the other thing that we did is based on that first cluster analysis that we did, if a journal had both policy and management in the title, we tended to put it in whichever cluster it belonged to, because it meant that it had closer connections to that group of journals than to the other management or policy journals. But in general, there's actually a lot of work that is, some of which is being funded by the NSF to constantly kind of revise the way that journals are being categorized, because different citation databases like Web of Science and Scopus are probably the 2 best known ones, but they have completely different systems for categorizing journals. And that has consequences for studies like these, right?
You can open it up to everybody if you want, Megan.
Sure. So I think if there are any faculty or other folks here who have questions or feedback, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, out of curiosity, you mentioned an article that Caroline Wagner had pointed out to the 2 of you. I forgot their names for a second, but that was 2008, and later on one of the slides I saw 2010. So if they've written multiple times on this stuff.
Raffles and Meyer. Yeah. This is kind of the space that they're writing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they've done both conceptualization of it and then empirical studies looking at knowledge integration in the space that they're interested in.
Okay.
But the measures they use, like the measures that we use, are used in other studies, bibliometric studies, to assess disciplinary diversity and network citation coherence.
Thank you for the presentation. It's always fun to see this. I'm guessing some of what you're seeing is also a function of who's writing the papers and what their training is. In terms of your recommendations, what about the training of our doctoral students? And so I assume some of this is just the doctoral programs people are coming out of and they're exposed to.
Yeah, so I think that part of how I would answer that question is ours is really the first study that I know that's looking at the field level and using this kind of bibliometric techniques at the field level. Like I said, there's been stuff that's focused specifically on maybe like policy implementation, so a really specific topical area. And I think having, I already shared the early results from the second study that Becky was just mentioning with my class here, actually, because I think that part of it is people understanding how they fit into like a bigger context and how they can contribute and where they fit in, and starting to understand where there are opportunities for more bridging between different knowledge bases that have been formed. So I think that that's part of how this could fit into to that. And then, but in terms of, I would completely agree with you. And I think Becky and I are both testaments to this, that how you're trained as a doctoral student, the program that you're coming out of orients you towards publishing in particular journals, right? And even publishing on particular topics and drawing on particular, frameworks when you're doing the research.
And it's not easy to be a Nexus scholar if you want to speak to more than one audience, like it's different. I write differently for a public administration journal than I do for a nonprofit journal. And I pull from different literature. And I think that maybe could be something that could be brought into doctoral education. It's like we want to teach them how to speak to their own discipline, but how do you talk across disciplines and speak to other audiences?
In the 1980s, there were a variety of articles in PAR and other journals criticizing study of public administration for not having much of an identity, and that the research that they did was not referenced, right? 40 years later, Perry and Kramer, I'm thinking about, right? Things have changed quite a bit. Now, I really like that people pay attention to epistemological questions, because what you're doing is epistemology. How do we acquire knowledge? Now, I have a follow-up question. What can you do with what you now know about the extent to which non-profit, public management and public administration, public policy literature are connected or not? What can you do with that? Because the epistemological question that you empirically investigate does not add anything to empirical knowledge about the various specializations within nonprofit or etc. So what can you do with this? And by the way, I really like the stuff. So it's not being nasty or anything.
Well, I would push back a little bit about not adding to the specializations within. That's really where we tried to go with actually looking at the topics, not just staying at the field level, and actually building out a taxonomy that didn't exist before that's comprehensive. But the discussion section of our paper is actually really focused on what do we do with this now. And I don't know if you want to dig into some specific things about the discussion.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to build on this. I think it could even be potentially used to help build theory in terms of helping us to understand where are we lacking, right? Like what's getting stuck, and identifying like there's some big ideas in this discipline that aren't being brought in to study this particular topic. And what can we do to integrate that more? So I think what it helps us to do is just take this snapshot, this landscape, and say, okay, well, if there's an area that I'm doing research in and there's the potential for knowledge integration, that means that there's research out there that I'm not connecting to. And that as a scholar, I could maybe do better due diligence or maybe do more to talk to some of those scholars in another discipline and just do more to understand like what's happening over there that's relevant for my research rather than just being so insulated. And I do a lot of work on volunteering, and that happens a lot with volunteering or even just nonprofit sites in general. Sometimes people will submit an article to Nonprofit Voluntary Sector Quarterly, which is a multidisciplinary journal. You can tell they wrote the article for their home discipline. And I'm always pushing back and saying, no, you have to connect to this bigger multidisciplinary literature because that's the audience of our journal. and you're not like, they're not contextualizing their work in that bigger literature that would really benefit them. And I get frustrated sometimes as a reviewer where I'm like, wow, I can see the value of what you're doing, but there's so much else out here that would increase the value of what you were doing if you were more aware of it. So, I think just as a scholar, I can maybe be a little bit better at looking beyond my traditional boundaries just to see what I can bring in and how I can use that.
Well, you are aware of the fact that we've never read enough, right?
Yeah, no, that's true.
I told doctoral students once in a foundations class 20 years ago, they said, so after this foundations class, we know the study well enough to get through the comps, right? I said, well, keep in mind, there's more published in a day than you can read in a year. You should have seen that. I've learned to live with it.
So true. Well, we hope to make it easier, right? To kind of
Yeah.
point out, like,
Yeah.
here's a connection that's not being made that would be low hanging fruit.
And I would like to just build on that with a couple of examples. So with volunteerism, one thing that we found is that although co-production and volunteerism are often there seems like a lot of potential there for knowledge integration, right? But they're really not. Co-production doesn't really cite the volunteerism literature.
Is anybody a co-production scholar?
No, I know that stuff.
Yeah,
So-
they're almost hostile to bringing in ideas from volunteering, but there's so much overlap.
Yeah, and that is reflected in the results that we're showing. And then another one that really jumped out at me was philanthropy, because one of the, both normatively and empirically, some of the research that's coming out of public administration, public policy is looking to private philanthropy or even community philanthropy to help subsidize public service delivery. But for the most part, public administration journals are not actually drawing on nonprofit studies on philanthropy and charitable giving. And that's a really important missing piece to understand what is being funded and how private and community philanthropy work in order, before you really want to say, well, we can rely on private charitable giving in order to subsidize public services. So, the topical analysis that we do really does help point to specific areas where there not only is an opportunity for knowledge integration, but in some cases it was kind of like, wow, why isn't that happening?
Great. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you, that's fun. And I don't come from PA background, so it's always interesting for me to see the things that mapped out. It is my and I know this isn't part of your current study, but it kind of left me wondering, looking at the yellow up in the corner, like what are the places where if only so much citations are happening, drawing from administration and public policy, where are the other articles that we're citing from that are not part of the nonprofit like trio up there? And, I'm looking at other interdisciplinary people in the room. And so what are those other disciplines?
That's a great segue, Jill. So let me actually share my screen again.
Because I do think it's this question about training and like, if so your folks such as yourselves are citing kind of like this way, maybe we've got citations going like this way and this way, depending on your discipline. So
I will say that what I'm going to show you next is another descriptive study, but it's taking it. So this study that we just presented is focused internally on public affairs. The next article that we're working on is focused externally, so knowledge integration kind of across disciplines and what we're bringing into public affairs in order to write our pieces. I think part of the question that you're asking is, why do people choose to publish in specific journals? And that's not what we're writing about, although there was recently a piece about consensus and nonprofit studies research, so that it's exciting that there's starting to be some of that that we could contribute to in the future. That's just not what we're doing right now. So without further ado then, let me talk about this. So in this piece, I'm going to show you 3 networks. So these networks are different than what we were looking at before. So here, the nodes are in the journals, and the size is the number of articles that were published. But here, 2 journals are connected if they are cited by the same third article, if I an article. So this network is based on articles that were published in nonprofit studies journals. So what we can see is, of course, we cite a lot of Voluntas and NPSQ, But can you guys see the colors? Kind of, okay, so one thing that's interesting is NML is actually closer to PAR and JPART than it is to Voluntas and NBSP. Voluntas tends to be cited to these, in this dark blue network, these are more like international studies, like world development and public administration development. And then NBSQ is closer to sociology journals, right, which is not unexpected given that nonprofit studies actually merged from sociology and social work. And then the red are, it's actually more psychology, but leading into management. And then here, the green is more management. Do you want to advance to the next slide?
When you say management, do you mean?
Like Academy of Management, so more like big like business schools, like journals that folks in business schools are publishing. So this looks pretty different than, this is the public administration network that's based on the same kind of analysis. So we've got, obviously PAR and JPART are really heavily cited in PA journals. Over here we've got like both public policy and other public administration journals. And then these are like psychology and management journals. So it's almost, the clusters are almost bifurcated, like this is kind of internal to PA, and then we're drawing out a whole lot of management stuff in public administration. And then the third one, sorry, is sociology that we're there. Sociology is in here, like this is the American Journal of Sociology. So much lighter citation of sociology journals in PA than in nonprofit studies. And then this is the public policy, the equivalent public policy network. So we've got, Brian, you might be interested in this. This is like the finance section that are like kind of off in their own world. And then we have a cluster of economic journals that they're citing. We've got, this is like the policy and political science journals. These, this is where NBSQ is and sociology. So this is more, I interpreted this as kind of like a social policy cluster. And then up here is energy and environmental policy. So it's very much like the policy topical areas. And then this is from 2009 to 2020. The breakdown in the disciplinary citations, and I only included a label if it was over 5%. So, and this is nonprofit, public administration, and public policy. So what we can see is, number one, this is the accounting and finance. So this is public policy. So there's like over 5% of the citations are for public policy or for finance. Only in public policy, it's much lower in PA nonprofit. 3 is management and marketing, which is much higher in nonprofit studies and public administration, as we would expect, than in public policy. Econ is heavily cited in public policy and to a lesser extent in the other two. And then political science is kind of a force in all of them, although at different levels. Like it's interesting that it's much more dominant in public policy than it is in public administration, nonprofit studies. And here's Yos, I think one thing that you will find interesting. 40% of the citations in public administration journals are other public administration journals. So we do have a strong identity as a field in terms of like public administration. However, there's a lot of like internal speaking going on, and it's maybe time to like turn a little bit outwards. And then the other thing that stands out to me about this is, this is across these 3 fields, this is public affairs, right? So the 3 fields are contributing different things to public affairs. Like they're integrating different knowledge. Nonprofit studies tends to bring in a lot more sociology, for example, than the other 2. So like, I think that it's important to understand not just how they're similar and connected, but also the different things that they're bringing in. So the shared.
So our goal this week is to write this up and
Yeah.
send it on to journal, right?
Stephanie.
PAR, I think we're gonna send it to PAR.
Stephanie, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I'm echoing Stephanus wrote, this is so cool in the chat, and I agree 100%. This stuff is just amazing. So I had a question earlier on, just more about like pragmatically, given that disciplines or even within like nonprofit studies and PA, people use different terminology for the exact same thing. How did you deal with that when you were coding? So like I'm thinking about like even like motivation and like how people talk about it in the PA literature and how people talk about it in the nonprofit literature are two very different things. Or, you know, the administrative burden that's talked about very differently depending on which literature you're in. I mean, what did pragmatically, like as you were thinking about coding and categorizing this stuff, what did you do with that stuff?
So I'm glad that you asked this question, Stephanie. So this is a big part of why we moved away from the topic modeling that we were doing. So I have a feeling that everyone has read at least or encountered at least one article that's using topic modeling, but topic modeling is machine learning where it's all based on the words that are being used, right? The problem is that, as Stephanie is just pointing to, sometimes we use different terminology to mean essentially the same thing. And also there's terminology that sounds like it should be the same thing that is actually different. So the one, I'm gonna blank on the example that we encountered. It was like welfare mixes and welfare policy were some of the things that came up. So what we found when we were using topic modeling is that it wasn't picking up on some connections that we thought we knew were important. And even when there's a way that you can approach like pairings of words or three words together that have a different meaning than they would if they were paired with like three other words. But even with that, we just weren't satisfied with the results we're getting. So that was why we turned to hand coding. So, you know, the short answer to your question is, Stephanie, that this is like months of hand coding work to kind of go through every single one of these abstracts and understand how we could connect things that linguistically might have been a little bit different. And then there is a piece that maybe is like a couple of years out, but since we have all this hand coded data, we also have the results of some early topic modeling. We also just kind of wanted to like raise a little bit of a red flag that like, hey, there's this cool thing called topic modeling, but there's some real issues with it. And not that some of that hasn't been done in other journals before, but I think it's always more relevant when it is in your field. And as people are starting to use more bibliometric approaches and topic modeling in public affairs, we just want people to be thoughtful consumers and thoughtful reviewers of it. So
I'd say the same with bibliometric studies in general. We've encountered so many challenges with the data, things that are missing or miscoded that we had to go back and fix. And it's not just a like download and go kind of situation. So we've actually become much more thoughtful reviewers of other bibliometric studies and you know, raise the bar, because, you know, if they just plug and chug, there's probably a lot of errors in their data.
I have a question about this picture too. I love this. And you mentioned sociology. We're trying to recruit a sociologist right now, so this is near and dear to my heart. But I'm wondering, you know, I know we cite a lot of sociology, org behavior, org theory work. And I'm wondering, like, I don't see sociology as one of the categories down below. And I'm wondering if it's like being combined with another grouping, or if this is just like an abstraction and sociology shows up in the larger article, or where does sociology show in this? And I saw it in the network diagrams, but not here.
sure. So I saw this, I created these slides kind of last minute because we were like, do we incorporate the new stuff? Do we not incorporate? We just thought that people would find it interesting. So I didn't include all of the labels down here that are up here. So that's one piece of it. But another piece of it, and this came up in a conversation, Aaron, you and I were having recently, and Russell as well, is a lot of org theory is now like it's more often being published in the business journals than it is in sociology. And so it's no mistake that this, you know, that management and marketing is such a large piece of both nonprofit studies and public administration, because we're still using those theories quite often, but this is super exciting to do that rather than sociology journals. And I should also say these are journal citations, not book citations, because we don't have an easy way to classify books by discipline. Okay, so and that is like a known kind of challenge when people are doing bibliometric work. It's easier to work with journals than books. Yes, Aaron.
I have an instrumental question, actually based on a conversation Russell and I were having last week. And it's about editors versus like our doctoral students.
Yeah.
Russell and I were talking about the common question in nonprofit studies, what's the best PA journal for nonprofit work, or which PA journals accept nonprofit work? And I imagine that shifted over time based on editorships. And it seems like you would see that to some extent in your data. And I was just curious if you had thoughts on what, like in terms of citations and connections between journals, like which PA journals are most friendly to nonprofit studies, and does that change over time?
So we haven't looked at, because we were looking at the field level, we haven't actually broken it down by specific journals, but we could easily do that based on this. I think that there was definitely like what I did do early on, well, actually, we can just go back to this. I do have here, so PAR, can you see my cursor on the screen? Is right here, and just the size of it means that it's definitely being cited more. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, we didn't, this is not in our published results, but I think that PAR was showing up as a big place where a lot of our like articles at the Nexus were being published. And I think that, yeah, I could, if, ask me again, I can easily pull those results for you. They're just not part of the article.
It speaks a little bit to editorial power and discretion, just like I think that.
But I think also along with that, though, I think it's also has to do with topic and framing for the audience. Because one mistake I do see people making is like, if you're not in the Nexus, like if it's a nonprofit topic that's not in the Nexus, it's going to be a real hard sell. But if you're in the Nexus, it's a much easier sell for a PA or P journal. But also, like, are you framing it for that audience? And I think that's sometimes the mistake people make is like they're writing it for a nonprofit audience rather than a public administration audience. So they're not situating it always in the best way, you know, like, and I think that's where what we do can be helpful is like to help understand and identify like how do the people in public administration think about and talk about this topic.
But I think you're broadening the Nexus too, right? The Nexus usually is just like nonprofits, you know, like government contracts with
Yes.
nonprofits. That's your traditional, like, that's where it's okay to have integration or overlap, but you're saying that it can be quite a bit broader than.
Right, well, and I mean, there were topics that hadn't come up at all before and what had been published. I was also just thinking, Erin, to your question, the next piece that we're working on for NBSQ, which we probably won't get out until like the end of the summer, but it is, we looked at all the articles that were published in NBSQ, NML, and Voluntas over a 20-year period. We did a similar hand coding of all of those abstracts, like independent of this stuff. And we're going to be looking at like disciplinary integration there as well. And so that I think also kind of points to some of your question, although not the specific like what journals are most open to publishing proper research. All right, thanks, Stefan. I'm glad you thought it was cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you being here and engaging with us. Yeah, appreciate it.